Honorable members, the Honorable Mr. President,
Veuillons nous asseoir. La séance est reprise.
The session is opened. Mr. Clark, can you give us the items in our order of the day?
Le quatrième point.
Fourth item in our order today is a presentation and debates on the report on repealing defamation laws to promote press freedom.
Hello.
Honorable members, in accordance with Article 38 of our Rules of Procedure, I have the pleasure to invite Mr. Romana Cacchioli, Director of PEN International, and Mrs. Ikponwosa Ero, independent expert from the United Nations on human rights. This is not it, says the President.
Quel rapport qu'on étudie?
C'est ce rapport.
Presentation and debates on the report on repealing defamation laws to promote press freedom. I invite the Chairperson of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights to make his presentation.
Honorable
President of the Pan-African Parliament, dear colleagues, dear guests, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about the report of the committee on the workshop on repealing defamation laws to promote press freedom. The Committee on Justice and Human Rights and the Committee on Education Culture, Tourism and Human Resources organized a joint workshop with PEN International on the 7th of March 2018. The workshop took place following a meeting of the two committees in October 2017. In a number of countries around the world and in Africa, governments continue to stifle freedom of the press, public debate, political criticism and media reporting by using laws that make it possible to sue journalists following writings on anything that is considered as defamatory. These laws are generally broad and have a scope of application that is very wide. This opens the way to different interpretations, and this represents an impediment to journalism, particularly investigation journalism and other aspects of the media to carry out its oversight role for the benefit of the public. The threat of penal sanctions provided for in the laws targets the media and prevents the media to investigate delicate or embarrassing topics such as high-level corruption and among high officials or law violations. This facilitates official secret, and this prevents the right to accountability in different countries. Particularly journalists or editors-in-chief have refused to censor themselves, and they are sued on the basis of penal laws and criminal laws, and they are subjugated to lawsuits, and this leads to imprisonment for months and years. So the objective of the workshop is given here in the paper. It deals with criminal laws on defamation. The aim is to see the impact of these laws on freedom of the media. We also discussed the importance of media ethics. We presented an updated resolution based on the Midrand Declaration on the freedom of the press for development and the need for reform. This was discussed, and we hope that it will be approved by PAP. We have not received a copy of this, but this is what we prepared in any case. Now, on the campaign carried out by PEN International, I'm not going to give you too many details on that, but we know that the PEN International representatives are here with us, and they will talk about that. Let me talk about the laws on defamation in the continent, also the application of these laws. We have here the situation in Africa. Legally speaking, there is a defamation when the rights of persons to protect their reputation are affected by what others say or write about this. This is usually in the form of a compensation because of the violation of personal reputation. So resorting to this is very much open. That's at the legal level. So defamation obliges a number of people to report the defamation to the police. The police investigate defamations and have the right to investigate the matter. Defamation is comparable to theft, and the state intervenes to enable the victim to regain reputation. Defamation is a crime that brings together two individuals and not the entire society, and should be treated like any other civil dispute. There is no need to involve the state mechanism to implement a punishment on a crime that involves two individuals. There is also law on defamation and and this is a law on insults. The aim is to help to protect the reputation of officials and state symbols. Many people indeed are usually caught in the net, and this dissuades people from expressing themselves. The laws on penalization, defamation, and insults are used by democracies in Africa. These laws are inherited from the colonial times. They were destined to fight against freedom fighters and liberation movements which fought against colonization. These laws are similarly used during the colonial period. The aim is to stifle dissidents and to do what is a challenge to the status quo. We dealt with examples of countries which have seen their situations improve, but I'm not going to deal with that in some detail. During the discussions, we talked about research, and we showed that imprisonment would not be beneficial to the citizens of Africa, and we need to put an end to this. This does not mean that journalists are not accountable when they do something wrong. What matters most is to find the ways and means to protect journalism ethics and to protect freedoms. It would be counterproductive to repress freedom of expression and the media. When you put in place adequate measures to train journalists who go over the board, you will improve the quality and the efficiency of press organs. You will also reinforce the credibility of these organs. There is a risk of depenalization and defamation, and the issue of press responsibility. Many research investigations show that civil intervention is more efficient than state provisions. The training of journalists and other stakeholders can improve ethical practices or practices that are not of high ethics, and this should enable us to regulate the media and the respect of ethical standards. PAP considered this issue and adopted a declaration 5 years ago. It's called the Declaration of Madrid on the Freedom of the Press in Africa. The declaration has 3 objectives: launch a campaign, establish an award, and establish an index of freedom of the press. Recommendations now. The committee recommends more efforts to identify alternative modes of dispute settlement as provided by the Council of the Press. There should be also provision for compensation, and this should lead to withdrawal of defamatory statements. Punishing defamation is not the best possible way. The state should not be involved in issues that can be settled among conflicting parties through legal means. Conclusions. The abrogation of defamation laws will be beneficial to the freedom of the press because media will operate without a constraint in their societies. It is desirable to have more freedom than less freedom. The presence of bad journalism should not constitute a constraint because bad journalism will always exist. We need to indicate that there is no good journalism or bad journalism. There is as much good journalism as bad journalism. This may be a precedent for others who would go into self-censorship to avoid being investigated and to avoid being imprisoned or their homes searched. We need to have a more in-depth debate, and these practices will stifle public debate and the space for public debate. Mr. President, dear colleagues, I thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, I would like to invite Romana Cacchioli, Director of PEN International, to make her statement. Mrs. Romana, you have the floor. Is it Mrs. or Mr.? It's Mr. I do apologize, sir. This is what I found on my paper. Thank you.
Hein? C'est comment? Vous ne faites pas de...
Honourable President and members of the Pan-African Parliament, my name is not Romana Cacchioli. My name is Simon Delaney, and I have been asked to represent PEN International in place of Ms. Cacchioli, who sends her apologies for not being able to attend. I am joined by my colleague Nogukanya Mgwabe, who will speak to you as well. Thank you, Honourable Nyirakundu, for your address, and thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation on this vitally important topic. I would like to make a short presentation on the following issues. Firstly, I would like to briefly address the case law in Africa, the court judgments that have come out from African courts on this issue of criminal defamation, and the responses of African institutions on the issue. Secondly, I would like to talk about which states have repealed the crime of defamation, as well as those states that are in the process of repealing. So the good news stories. Thirdly, I would like to discuss the effect that these laws have on writers and the public's greater right to know. And lastly, I would like to talk about solutions that we can come up with jointly to address this issue. So firstly, the situation in Africa is that there is a consensus amongst many that the laws on defamation should be repealed because criminal defamation laws have a chilling effect on speech. They hamper the right to freedom of expression and the right to information. When I say there's consensus, there is certainly consensus amongst African institutions. Firstly, in 2010, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights passed Resolution 169, which called on state parties to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights to repeal criminal defamation laws or insult laws which impede freedom of speech. In 2014, the African Court on Human and People's Rights passed a judgment in the case of Konate versus Burkina Faso. The court unanimously found that Mr. Konate had been wrongly imprisoned. The court found that criminal defamation could not be punished via imprisonment. And just this year, earlier in 2018, the Court of Justice of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, found that the Gambia's laws criminalizing speech and its treatment of 4 journalists during their arrest violated their right to freedom of expression. The Gambia was directed to immediately repeal or amend laws on criminal defamation, sedition, and false news in line with its obligations under international law. As PEN International, we welcome the fact that certain states have repealed or are in the process of repealing criminal defamation laws. Now, Ghana is a shining example of this. In 2001, it fully repealed the crime of defamation. The Gambia and Burkina Faso, as I've said, have been directed by African courts to repeal those laws. And just recently, in 2016 and 2017, both Zimbabwe and Kenya declared that criminal defamation laws are unconstitutional in their countries. There is progress and commitment to repeal these laws in both South Africa and Sierra Leone. The question is always, what is the problem with these laws? Why should we not punish journalists for making mistakes? Because we punish all citizens for the mistakes they make against the public. Now, PEN International has done extensive research on the impact of these laws on writers. PEN focused on a few countries, South Africa, Sierra Leone, Uganda, and Zambia, and found that these laws, which carry severe penalties, including imprisonment, are widely used by those in power to silence their critics. In other words, it is not a bona fide or legitimate punishment of journalists for the mistakes they make. In fact, it is a very crude, a very brutal tool to punish journalists for speaking the truth and telling truth to power. That is their crime. These laws on criminal defamation have a chilling effect on investigative reporters and other writers who are conscious of the possibility of serving lengthy prison sentences and leaving them with a criminal record. And when journalists are intimidated, when they are prevented from telling stories which the public want to know, because oftentimes they concern matters of public importance, such as the progress of government's commitment to serving the public. When journalists are not able to tell these stories for fear of arrest and imprisonment, then this obviously affects the public's right to know, because these stories will no longer be in the public domain. They won't be published. The lessons learned from Ghana are that there is a need for adequate training of journalists and appropriate broadcast regulation to ensure ethical journalism. There is a need for appropriate safeguards to ensure that the civil suits are not excessive. Even when there are no criminal defamation laws, people with power and money will often sue journalists or sue newspapers for huge amounts of compensation. The threat of having to pay enormous amounts of compensation is in itself a chilling force on investigative journalism. Again, the question often comes up, so what do we do about journalists that make mistakes, that violate people's right to privacy and dignity? Once a newspaper has exposed somebody, even if what they say is not true, it can ruin people's reputations, it can ruin people's lives. Now, we understand that, of course, as writers. But there are alternatives to imprisonment which don't violate the rights of writers and the public's right to know. The alternative mechanisms exist. We must use them. These forums can be used to sanction errant journalists. the ones who make mistakes. There are media councils. There are civil defamation forums. You can go to court without putting journalists in jail. Now, as Honorable Nyarakundu mentioned, defamation is a private dispute. It concerns one person or one newspaper saying something about another person. This insult doesn't concern the whole country, and therefore the mechanism of the state to punish should not be put into operation. That is inappropriate. There should not be a prosecution of journalists in pursuance of protecting the public. The public is not protected when criminal defamation laws are used to prosecute journalists. States can ensure that defamation is addressed solely as a matter of civil law and include adequate safeguards to prevent the imposition of fines or compensation awards so excessive as to imperil media freedom, including media diversity and plurality. There are alternative dispute resolution forums, such as I've mentioned, the Press Council or Ombudsman, where compensation awards can be made. There can be a decision for the newspaper to publish an apology, a retraction of what was said if it was false. Now, these alternative measures are equally effective at holding people accountable for the things that they say. The focus should therefore be restricted to such things as the development of ethical media codes of practice, media training and sensitization programs, accreditation and the threat of withdrawal of these, so that the press functions more effectively as the eyes and ears of society. South Africa is a good example of how a strong press regulatory body, the Press Council system that we have, is generally effective. Cases are generally resolved. There is a high success rate. So in conclusion, if you invest in these alternative mechanisms to resolve private disputes involving defamation, then this will both strengthen the public's right to know and strengthen the media's capacity to engage the public and to tell the stories that the public has a right to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I would now like to hand the floor to my colleague, Ms. Mngwabe from PEN International.
Madam, you have the floor. It's not you who give the floor, I am the one who give the floor here. Madam, you have the floor.
Honorable President of the Pan-African Parliament, honorable members, guests, I thank you for this opportunity to address you today. I will keep it brief. My name is Nogukanya Mngwabe. I am the South African National Coordinator of the PEN entity. I would just like to follow on what my colleague said, which is to thank the Pan-African Parliament for the opportunity to engage on this important issue. PEN has worked with the African Commission, with the African Court, with the UN Special Rapporteur to pursue avenues for repealing the criminalization of defamation, and in particular, following the Konate judgment, is working with the Pan-African Parliament to support the Pan-African Parliament's commitment to strengthen press freedom in line with the Midrand Declaration of 2013. PEN International offers its full support, technical support, to the advancement of this issue, and we look forward to the operationalization of the resolution once taken forward. As we indicated, we are a worldwide membership and a collective of writers, all of whom have expressed support for the decriminalization of defamation. And I would just like to read briefly a petition which has been signed by, amongst others, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Abdelaziz Baraka Sakin, Adaf Suif, and Tsitsi Dangaremba, amongst others. As African writers, they have expressed their concern and as advocates of freedom of expression, we are deeply concerned by the continued existence in the majority of African states of colonial-era laws which continue to treat defamation as a criminal offense. These laws are invariably used to silence writers, journalists, and others, and often carry heavy penalties, including imprisonment and political disenfranchisement. This form of state-sanctioned silencing is fundamentally incompatible with the right to freedom of expression and is used deliberately and systematically to crack down on dissident voices and to prevent criticism, particularly of those in authority. These laws serve as a noose around the neck of writers. The laws deprive the public of vital information and cripple our ability to hold the powerful to account. In particular, we would like to call on African states to abolish criminal defamation and insult laws as a matter of urgency and call for the immediate release of writers who have been jailed under such charges. Freedom of expression is an essential part of a free and fair society. Our shared hope for the continent is of a land where knowledge necessary towards making informed choices is abundant and perpetually the birthright of every citizen. We express our thanks once more for this opportunity to address this August plenary, and we extend our continued support. I thank you.
Thank you very much. J'ai devant moi.
I have in front of me a list of presenters. I will call on them following the order. There's Honorable Senator Paulette Ngeni from Gabon.
J'ai l'honorable.
I have Honorable Sekou Faratour from Mali. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I would like to extend greetings to all the honorable members of Parliament here present. And I know that we are here to discuss the suffering which journalists undergo in our continent. Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of association are undeniable rights, so that for a state to be called a democratic country, it has to respect all these rights. Our countries increasingly say they are democratic, but they continue to attempt to stifle some rights, especially the rights of journalists. They are indeed suffering. Meanwhile, a tree cannot hide a forest. There are some journalists who use their profession to hurt other people. By way of example, there's my friend Biseri. I I can give him a few dollar notes, and if I give money to a journalist, he could go and make a very bad declaration against Mr. Bisuri, my friend. So what I'm saying is that the profession of journalism should not accept such practices. Therefore, I stand against those journalists who carry out such practices. And we have many of them in Africa who claim to be journalists who really don't have any knowledge, no deontology, no skills in the profession of journalism. So we are dealing with a very critical situation. Those who are of good faith are often penalized because it may be said that, okay, they are journalists, they don't do anything good. So I would like that henceforth we should make the dichotomy between journalists who are trained and who respect the ethics of the profession and those who maybe just know how to speak and they just pick their pen or they go to a radio station and just start saying anything they like. If we can make that distinction between the two, that will be fine. And if we can train our journalists, I think we would be making a step forward. If I take the example of Mali, we have over 1,000 radio stations, FM radio stations, and there's also the television. And the confusion is such that the state is forced to intervene to control this proliferation of the media. Can you imagine this situation? So today, we are saying that journalists should not be punished, but they should indeed do their job. Thank you. Thank you very much, dear colleague. I would give the floor to Honorable Tunya Benedin from Mauritius.
I would like to thank the chairperson of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights and also PEN International for the report and for the inputs. Of course, we as politicians, as a responsible citizen, we are all for the freedom of the press because they constitute what we call the pillar of democracy. And I think that freedom of the press and freedom of expression should be embedded in the constitution of all our countries because it's a way that we can communicate to the population. And even if some articles or some reports are not to our taste or they criticize us, I think this helps to take remedial action so that we go on the right path all the time. But as has been pointed by my colleague from Mali, I think that the right of journalism to criticize should also we should also bear in mind that we should have the respect of the rights of the individual, not to have any sort of defamation. And we also know that we have, for example, now what is happening with the social media, what we call also cybercrime. This is an issue that we must take into consideration because these people who write on Facebook to defame others, they don't have any training. And we do not see anything happening. If they are sharing their experience for the good, this is correct. But if you try to defame others and use social media in a wrong way, this is not good for our democracy. Therefore, I think that we should, the question is that, how best we can preserve the right to expression, the right of journalists to do their work correctly. I think that the proposal that has been made in the report for press councils, I think is important because we have to give training. There should be a framework whereby journalists can operate and work in a responsible manner to serve our society. Before I end, I would like to just to draw the attention of the chairperson of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights, that in the conclusion when we were in the committee, we said that we should maintain only the three lines, up to the removal of criminal definition, up to more freedom than less. We don't want qualification, presence of bad journalists should not be a constraint, etc. I think these are mere literature. We want the essence to figure in the report. This is, I would like to draw the attention of the House. Thank you, President.
Thank you. Rob Janet Ongera from Kenya. Let me give the floor to Honorable Jude Njomo from Kenya. And now I want to give the floor to Honorable Rumba Workia from Burkina Faso.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. President. I was going to say that it is baseless, but I indeed have something to say because I've just arrived, so I didn't quite follow the presentation. I was late. But what I wanted to say is that I stand for critical journalism, positive journalism, a system of journalism which makes concrete proposal, a form of journalism which is honest and responsible. On the other hand, I would say no to a form of journalism which is negative, a form of journalism which makes no proposals, a form of journalism which is indeed inappropriate. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Honorable Amusubi from Togo. Thank you, Mr. President. I think after my colleague from Mali, I really don't have much to say. But in the presentation, he said that it is those in power who try to malhandle journalists. But there's the other side of the coin. The government also pays journalists to defame the opposition. And in my country, it is indeed the order of the day. If you want to become rich, if you want to be a rich journalist, well, go to the government and they'll give you millions and millions to defame the opposition parties. I believe that they have referred to a number of measures, but I believe that there's some education to be done. There's a need to train journalists so that these journalists could indeed respect the ethics of their profession. This is extremely necessary. Decriminalizing, yes, I agree, but this should be done in conjunction with intensive training for journalists. Thank you. Thank you very much, dear colleague. I'll give the floor to Honorable Professor Ogol Delatico from Uganda.
Je donne la parole à l'honorable.
I'll give the floor to Honorable Oscar Nsama from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'll give the floor to Honorable Dr. Zalikuta Diallo from the Republic of Guinea. Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to take my turn to congratulate the chair of the Permanent Committee on Human Rights and Judicial Affairs and the two presenters from PEN International. It is an issue which concerns all of us because quite often we face a dilemma. As you must be aware, Mr. President, dear colleagues, we have come a long way. We inherited regimes, single-party governments, with a press which only works in the service of the government. It is at the time of democratization in Africa that laws had to change, and there was liberalization of the press and radio stations. So the press is indeed not real in our respective countries. Meanwhile, it is normal to decriminalize laws against defamation. And those who would be guilty of defamation should be punished in other ways. And this is very important so that the press should not be manhandled. But as the earlier speaker said, there's a proverb in our country which says, when you say that the rat should not move around, you should also tell it not to have a bad scent. So journalists should indeed respect the ethics of their profession, because it is a very important thing. The press is the fourth power, and this is very important. You should not affect the moral integrity of personalities. But in our countries, you can always see journalists who are paid. We could even call them mercenary journalists. They are specialized in criticizing people, and they could even become multimillionaires because they have been instrumentalized, they have been paid for what they're doing. And this is not really going to give a good image of the profession. So it is necessary for us to focus on this area. The civil society, for instance, should do its work. They should carry out some remarkable work by sensitizing people and ensuring that journalists are trained. There's also what we call the High Authority of Communication, which is a Republican institution, which is indeed in charge of calling the media and journalists to order where they go astray. And they have to be punished. So, and this could take the form of suspension of 7 days from their programs, or the program could indeed be prohibited. Microphone, please. So these are measures which could indeed dissuade those who go against the laws. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you. I would give the floor to Honorable Mamadou Olio Konde from the Republic of Guinea. I'll give the floor to Honorable Olio Konde from Cote d'Ivoire. I'll give the floor to Honorable Senator Obango Bon Lowo from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'll give the floor to Dr. Toussaint Manga from the Republic of Senegal. I'll give the floor to Honorable Alaji S. Dago from the Republic of Guinea. I'll give the floor to Honorable Elhaj Dio Kante from the Republic of Guinea. I'll give the floor to Honorable Chief Charamgira from the Republic of Zimbabwe.
President, may I thank the presenters on this important topic of criminalizing defamation by the media. I want to agree with the presenters that I come from a country, Zimbabwe, that has removed laws that criminalize defamation. So we have already crossed. We are together with you, the presenters, in terms of what you want to achieve. Having said that, as Zimbabwe, we have removed those laws. I would want to urge those that are pushing for this agenda also to look at both sides of the coin, which is that freedom comes with responsibility. You cannot grant freedoms to people who are irresponsible, to people who are unethical. And I want to support those that, as we grant these freedoms to the press, let's be given also the guarantee that the press itself is professional and ethical. It is true that that freedom is abused. But the presenter, unfortunately, you were talking of people who are arrested for telling the truth. There are cases where those people have not told the truth. So how do you defend those that have not been writing the truth? And I see that in your messages, you seem to be looking at only one side of the coin. There are innocent people who have been defamed and total falsehoods just to defame and kill their reputation. How do you take care of that as the proponents of freedom of expression? And as I say, I'm coming from a country where we agree there is no criminalization, and I agree with you. Criminal law means it's the state. So in this case, the state has not been defamed. It's the individual, the private individual agreed. But the problem is, given these freedoms, you have defamed, especially politically, some people, because you want this one to maybe to be the one who should win. In 1 minute, maybe because you want this person to be seen positively, you start painting an innocent person very negatively, just to achieve certain objectives. And I want you to concentrate on what do innocent people do, what recourse. It's very expensive. Some have no money to seek legal representation in court. How do you protect those that have no money to get legal services, to clear their names that have been tarnished? Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Chef.
Thank you very much, Chief. I'd like to give the floor to Honorable Marie-Claire Monte from Mauritius. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. Chair, let us first of all say that the profession is a very good one, and just like in politics. And if this word is secret, we may be able to use it. We may be able to use it to defame. Journalism, as a matter of fact, is a tool, a very precious tool, with the objective of informing people and not to disinform people. But there's also the violation of its primary function, and which goes beyond its profession. And that's why we have defamation, Mr. President. It also means that manhandling this press will always lead to criticisms, and it will not cure these acts of defamation. There must be freedom, even though there will be extremism, even though there will be those who will go beyond the required norms. What we see, unfortunately, Mr. President, training is reflected by programs which are not well coordinated, and that's what I wanted to share with you, and I'd like to thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honorable Member of Parliament. I'll give the floor to Honorable Masagunza from the Republic of Zambia.
De la Zambie.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Honorable Ngonga from Zambia.
Manga?
Ngonga.
Ngonga.
Ngonga from Zambia.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me this opportunity to add my voice on this important subject. And I would like to thank the Chairperson and the Committee on Justice and Human Rights, and also those that presented from PEN International. Adding the word to freedom of expression, Mr. President, is freedom of expression or freedom of speech is a very, very important human right that we all need to enjoy, regardless. And therefore, I tend to agree with the report that has given, and allow me, Mr. President, to just quote on page 2, where the report says the threat of criminal sanction that the laws provide inevitably deter media investigations into and reporting of issues governments consider sensitive or embarrassing, such as high-level corruption, official malpractices, law-breaking, and etc. Mr. President, the major reason that we have in Africa is, again, that most governments do not want to give or to enact laws that give journalists freedom of information. And where there are no freedom of information, journalists will find ways and means of investigating these, either malpractices or corruption that they would want to then bring to the fore so that people are aware. As we all know, they have an important role to play in society as a fourth arm of governance, And therefore, when you tend to stifle them, they will find ways and means of giving out this information. Some of it is unpalatable, and a lot of times you find that when people are in opposition, they will tend to go with these journalists. But as soon as they get the power and go into the leadership, they forget the same laws that impeded them getting the information that they wanted. And I think this is one of the things that we must do as parliamentarians and as people that speak for Africa generally, that we need to be open and to support that governments must definitely remove out these bad laws that tend to stifle journalists in order for them to perform the duties that they need to perform. The presenters from PEN have given an outline of alternative resolutions that can bring solutions to the issues of defamations. And these are very, very important and critical. And if we look at all of them, they provide solutions that we can encourage our governments to be able to look at. But most importantly is that our government...
Microphone, please.
Just 1 minute. If our governments were able to enact laws that allow the freedom to information, these issues of defamation will definitely minimize. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Honorable Fatou Diawara from Gambia. Fatou.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, looking at my own country as a whole, Gambia, we have 22 years of brutal dictatorship and misrule, which Gambians came together and end. Mr. President, the newfound democracy that the Gambia is enjoying today committed itself to friendly relationship among nations, promoting social progress, better living standards, human rights, freedom of press, and rule of law. Mr. President, this year, the Press Freedom Day, the new president of the Gambia has called on all media chiefs to prioritize the welfare of their reporters who are always in the front line to the government and the repealing of bad media laws. Mr. President, journalists play an important role in promoting democracy. They need to engage them in public debate and shape events around them, and to have more training about ethics of journalism. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Honorable El Gandhi Mustafa from Egypt. Thank you, Mr. President. Journalism is a profession of the prophets. That's how I was educated. I'm 58 years old, and I recall that when I was young, there was a newspaper, there was a television, and there was also the radio. We were in quest of information. Today, I believe that we have to look at it from another perspective, because today it is the information that is coming towards us. The information is looking for us. Today, the journalist we see through the web sees information which passes through. We should also say that this profession was bought by the major capitalists in the world, and they started using the machine for their own interest. And what happened? Increasingly, we start to believe only what is written, and when we look at the elections in the United States, which happened recently, for instance, the entire press, the written press, the television, were all against Donald Trump and even the social media, but he won. So what can this really prove? Mr. President, it can prove one thing, that we have to look at things from a global perspective. There should be no confidence. It should be the confidence of the reader, because he has a lot of information coming from everywhere. So today, even security itself is based on countries which make laws and which want to control the web, because we really don't know who is behind all of this anymore. And they could really affect a whole country with fabricated information. Of course, we stand for information. That is what we want. Everybody wants information. Of course, we want communication amongst people, but also there is insecurity. And we have to avoid a situation where one day we shouldn't see people fighting amongst themselves because of wrong information. Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I've listened to all of you, and the general discussions have come to a close. I would like to take my turn to make a contribution. I've always been opposed by international organizations which give us lessons and which seem to protect public liberties or human rights. It goes same for Amnesty International. Quite often, I don't understand how they make a relationship amongst things. I just want to make a common example. Someone could come, for instance, to my house and kills me and rapes my wife and rapes my daughter, and he does just everything he wants and goes away. There's no violation of human rights there. What he has done is a normal act. But on the other hand, if the person is arrested, he undergoes the same treatment, he will start crying that his human rights have been violated. So I would want us to be clear as far as these issues are concerned. All what our colleagues said are applicable in all our countries. Today, we no longer have confidence in journalists. And as Fantamada said, we want a free press. We want a press which informs and not one which defames, especially today with the existence of the social media. Something may take place in a country. He may use that information in the social media and say it is taking place in another country, and that this or that and that is taking place in this country, whereas neither the place nor the action or even the time could be real. Someone said here today that what's the problem of the press? The problem of the press today is the lack of ethics, lack of training. In my country, especially during this electoral period, politicians have taken the press hostage. You could insult Nkodo, you can say that he has stolen, and people put this in all the media. They could use someone's house which they've seen somewhere and say, oh, this is our money which has been used in building this house. So defamation has become the order of the day in our countries. On the other hand, we say, no, they should not be indicted. But how can we repair this prejudice which has been done? At a certain point, it was the order of the day when you see a very funny heading, the 100 homosexuals in Cameroon. And at times they even give the names and the numbers, number 1, number 2, number 3 of these homosexuals, and they put everything there. For someone who has a wife and children, how is he going to behave? How is he going to take this? So I stand for decriminalization of the press. But I think what you should also do is to have responsible journalists. This problem of corruption may require evidence. It may require evidence. It doesn't just mean that because someone has built a house, we say he's corrupt. Because someone buys a car, we say he's corrupt. Because he wants to go in for an election, they say he's a thief. I think at that juncture, there's a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of work to be done. The press should be responsible, a responsible press which will be respectful, and their information should be genuine. They should be able to defend the information they give. So we need a press which can prove that what it is saying is true. And as someone said here today, we want to be informed and not to be disinformed. So, Madam Chair, the work which you have done is indeed very important, but you need to forge ahead because increasingly we are giving power to women of the press. The colleague from Togo said that we have two types of press. It's just like the problem of the civil society in Africa. There's a pro-civil society and a civil society which is against. And that is where the difficulty lies when you want to talk about the civil society in Africa. But it is the same thing which our colleagues said here today in respect of journalists. Journalists are indeed paid to write wrong information about others. And if the others too have money, they could do the same. So I'd like to call on you all within the framework of your research to deal with this aspect to see how we can make a journalist who will be worthy of that name and not that journalist of the stomach. So I'll give you the floor for you to respond to a number of questions, or you take contributions from colleagues if you really don't have much to say. I'll give the floor, first of all, to the chair and two other speakers. Chair, please, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Right Honorable President. Let me thank fellow members of the Pan-African Parliament who have made contributions. So really, I don't have questions, rather comments, because I think we are all agreed on the fact that we need to depenalize. But at the same time, I think we need to make sure that there is need to ensure that there is the capacity to apply the law. When someone has broken the law, he has to be held accountable, journalist or no journalist. Because I think we hear from various countries, in various countries we've got schools of journalism and universities. If there are people who are working as journalists without the requisite training, then that is deplorable. It is important that the laws of the country dictate that journalists be trained, because you can't just go and become a surgeon or a doctor without any training. Therefore, it is important that we ensure that journalists who are employed in our various media outlets are properly trained. And I agree with what my colleague from Benin has stated. And they spoke about the journalists who criticize the government, who place all manner of issues on Facebook. My sense is that we need to have legal grounding, because it is important that we ensure that we know what the curriculum is in those schools. Is it courses that are not really tailored to the needs of journalists? So I think we need to ensure that there is also the capacity to uphold the law. Now, one of the colleagues spoke about the link between that and the report and the mistakes in the report. I think these are going to be corrected in due time. But we need to understand that they'll be brought to book. I think we can have other types of penalties. I think we can have civil penalties, and for cases that are more important, then we'll have stringent measures to be applied. But At the same time, I think we need to make sure that people, when they're penalized or they've got a fine to pay, sometimes the fine is so high that they will never be able to pay it. So we ensure that if the law applies to a civilian journalist, then it should be a civilian law, not one that sends somebody to the gallows forever, and that would disqualify journalists. I think I'm not going to dwell on that, but if in countries we have justice, then people need to be brought before the courts and they answer for their actions. If they are guilty, then they are sent to prison. If they aren't, then of course we have to free them. And our colleague from Guinea said that we've made quite some traction, and it is therefore appropriate that we depenalize this matter. But we need to make sure that we remain within the framework of the law. We can't just behave any which way we want. So if somebody is guilty of defamation, then he has to answer. Maybe not before a military court, but before civil law authorities. And this is the situation, whether it be in a country of the chairman of the Kappa Commission or mine. Well, freedom is a right, but at the same time, I think people need to behave lawfully. And we need to educate the population at large, because people need to learn to make a distinction, a critical distinction between what really happens and what doesn't happen. But to take it as a Bible, of a Quran, where we can't say anything, where we can't criticize anything, that too is not good. But what is required is that people are properly trained. And Honorable Malik said exactly the same thing with regard to informing rather than disinforming. And the gentleman from Zambia has repeated the same expression. And I think government, supposing that government don't want to do something, then I'm sure that as MPs, we are capable of initiating the drafting of laws which will cater for this particular crime. So these are laws that can help the society at large, and it's up to you and us to come up with those laws. And we need to also encourage government to withdraw laws that are inimical to press freedom. My colleague from the Gambia said that Gambia had gone through 22 years of dictatorship, and now Gambia is hard at work trying to restore the rule of law and the freedom of speech. And we thank them for that. And I think that people say that before we were looking for information. Now it's information that is seeking us. So we need to be very careful to protect the population and to make sure that they are guarded against the ill effects of propaganda media. And again, I think this morning when we were discussing, we spoke about the importance of fighting against cybercrime. I think all these things go together, and we need to be careful when we acquire technology. We have to make sure that that is accompanied by the legislation necessary to protect the population against disinformation, and also the manner in which this is going to impact our youth. Mr. President, I would like to say thank you again for your comments, but I think the African Union too has taken similar decisions since 2010, and countries have been encouraged to change their laws, and we will continue to work on laws that govern journalism in countries. I think all these things have to go hand in hand. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. The other two speakers, do they have anything to say?
Thank you, Honourable President. Simply to make the point that we will never live in a world of perfect journalism. Journalists will always make mistakes, like we all make mistakes. The difference is that when we make mistakes, we don't always go to jail. When we go to jail, that is because our countries have laws that say that those mistakes are so bad that we must go to jail to pay for those mistakes. Now, journalists are performing a public function. If they are not performing, or if they are making mistakes, if they are not reporting fairly, ethically, and accurately on the events of the day, then they are not meeting our expectations as the public. They need to be educated, they need to be trained. There are institutions, or there should be institutions, to train journalists. There should be institutions which impose fines on journalists, or require them to apologize, or retract their statements by making a full-page apology or retraction. Now, these institutions that the public can go to do not need to be expensive, because they do not need to be courts of law. A press council, for example, is not a court of law. In South Africa, the press council is available free of charge to anybody who is injured by false reporting. And so there is simply no need for laws on criminal defamation. The consequences of bad journalism should not be locking journalists in jail. Journalists do not have to speak the truth. They speak their opinion based on what they think are the facts. So the answer, Honourable President, is to train, to educate, and to empower journalists to meet our standards. It is a false dichotomy to say that either you have perfect journalists or no journalists at all. We need journalists. These are the eyes and ears of society. The cliché is that sunlight is the best disinfectant. We need sunlight on the events of the day. We need light to be shone on the actions and the policies of government officials. And journalists are the ones who tell us as citizens about what our governments are doing. We must allow them to make mistakes, and we must encourage them to correct those mistakes and do better in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam?
Thank you, Honourable President. Mine is just to be brief. We acknowledge and we recognize that there are journalists who do not use their platform responsibly. But I would just like to reiterate what my colleague has said. The dichotomy does not need to be between solely criminal sanction. There are creative ways of holding journalists to account, and we believe that greater press freedom leads to greater state accountability. However, we are cognizant that we do need to put in place appropriate mechanisms to hold errant journalists themselves accountable. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So the report is now open to either adoption or it is adopted. Honorable Clerk, you have the floor.
Il est prévu à l'ordre du jour.
On the agenda, we have the following. The presentation on the report on the action on albinism in Africa. The presentation on the report of the workshop, Action on Albinism in Africa. Let me invite the chairperson of the Standing Committee of the Legal Committee, the Justice Committee rather, and Human Rights to present her report. Ma'am.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Right Honorable President, for giving me the floor. Honorable colleagues, distinguished guests, allow me to share with you our report, the report of the Standing Committee on our discussions relating to actions on albinism in Africa. This report emanates from a meeting we held on the 9th of March 2018 and the United Nations independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism in collaboration with the Center for Human Rights and several organizations representing persons with albinism held a workshop with the Committee on Justice and Human Rights and the Committee on Gender, Family, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities of the Pan-African Parliament. The workshop took place on March 9, 2018 during the committee sessions of the Pan-African Parliament and was aimed at facilitating in-depth discussions on issues faced by persons with albinism on the African continent and thus discuss ways and means through which the Pan-African Parliament could foster further engagement among states and regional bodies on the issue. Whilst albinism-related stigmatization and discriminations are universal in nature, however, in African countries, people with albinism experience human rights violation of a much higher magnitude, including extreme acts of violence. These acts take the form of killings, mutilation, ritual rape, and robberies. The acts are motivated by erroneous myth that body parts of persons with albinism can bring wealth and good fortune when used in various rituals. To date, 600 killings have been reported in more than 27 African countries. Despite various campaigns and public outcry on the issue, African countries continue to register attacks perpetrated against persons with albinism. In May 2017, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights endorsed the Regional Action Plan on Albinism in Africa to prevent and end attacks against persons with albinism by 2021. The Regional Plan of Action is the first regional initiative prepared in Africa to comprehensively address discrimination and stigmatization against ritual attacks, and trafficking of body parts. The Regional Action Plan is the result of broad consultations undertaken in the region under the auspices of the United Nations independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism. To date, only Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, and Nigeria, as well as Tanzania, have elaborated or prepared national action plans that could foster a regional action plan. There is also still more work to be done to support national states in addressing the causes and the immediate needs of persons with albinism across the region. In this regard, the African Union has taken significant first steps to tackle the issue affecting people with albinism through the work of the Working Group on Rights of Persons with Disability of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. Furthermore, the recently adopted protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities contains a specific provision for persons with albinism. We believe that the workshop was aimed at facilitating an in-depth discussion on albinism and discuss means of action for the Pan-African Parliament. The specific objectives were as follows. And I would also like to indicate that there are problems relating to witchcraft, human rights, and the area of trafficking in body parts, which is often missed in national laws. We were also made aware of attacks against people with albinism, and usually they are linked to sorcery, and this has been mentioned earlier. And we have a number of case studies. We have a report in that regard. Now, let me move now to the discussions. Most people indicate this is a congenital disease, and people who have albinism are treated differently. And those who have this condition suffer the worst type of discrimination. With regard to the manner that is the most appropriate to deal with these people, the word albinism is deemed to be offensive, and the appropriate expression is people with albinism condition. And so we have come up with a manual addressed to the prosecutors so that they're able to better manage people who have committed crime against people living with albinism. And we know that the penal code does deal with matters that are not really related to people with albinism, and sometimes this leads to misunderstandings between them and the legal fraternity.
Se tourne vers un autre pays où la loi est moins rigoureuse.
As a consequence, the question needs to be addressed within the framework of the continent. Certain people living with albinism are doing good actions, and they can be positively noticed by their communities, and this can change the attitudes towards them in the community. Here we can talk about the cases of famous sportsmen. Recommendations. Now, the following recommendations were made, and the committee needs to make a public declaration to condemn the violation of the human rights of people living with albinism. The regional action plan needs to be approved by a resolution by the plenary of the Pan-African Parliament. This should enable the holding of an exhibition of photos of people with albinism, and this is aimed at sensitizing parliamentarians about the issue. To conclude, the grave concerns about the treatment of persons with albinism were revealed. The denial or curtailing of the human rights of persons with albinism is a serious problem that needs to be resolved. It was also agreed that the Committee on Justice and Human Rights, together with the UN expert on albinism, should develop a resolution that will be presented to the PAP plenary in May 2018. Mr. President, dear colleagues, the resolution was drafted, but it was not possible to translate it in the various working languages. We'll see what we can do with it. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Now, I would like to invite Mrs. Nkuza to take the floor. Ikponwosa, you have the floor. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished parliamentarians, thank you for this opportunity to discuss this important situation with you, the situation of persons with albinism in Africa. My name is Ikponwosa Ero, and I'm from Nigeria. I'm a person with albinism, and I'm the United Nations independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism. I'm sorry if I repeat some of the comments that was made by Madam Chair, who did a fantastic job summarizing the issues, but these issues have to be reiterated. One of the main reasons why this mandate was created in 2015 at the United Nations was to address and ultimately put an end to the ongoing attacks and discrimination faced by persons with albinism. While discrimination against this people group has been reported across the world, from every continent, cases of physical attacks against people with albinism have only been reported from this region of Africa. I'm very sad to report that I have received nearly 700 cases of attacks to date since 2007, attacks and violations against persons with albinism from 28 countries in this region. In some countries, over 120 cases have occurred in only 3 years alone. These include from Malawi and Mozambique. Cases of attacks and violations against persons with albinism include mutilations, ritual rape, grave robberies, and trafficking in body parts across borders. It is widely believed that many cases go unreported due to the lack of monitoring of these cases and the involvement of family members. Some of us may be aware of the recent case here in South Africa of 13-year-old Gabisile from Mpumalanga, who was brutally murdered and parts of her body stolen just in February this year. Her 15-month-old nephew was also killed in the process because the perpetrators thought he had albinism. On Monday, as I arrived here in South Africa, I received news from Mali that a 5-year-old girl with albinism had been stolen from her mother. As the mother tried to stop the people from taking her child away, she remembered that she also had a second daughter with albinism sleeping. Imagine the agony of having to decide, do I chase my daughter being taken, or do I go back and save the other one? Ultimately, the perpetrators escaped with her child. And yesterday, the 5-year-old was found with her head taken, decapitated, beside a mosque. This year, in the last 5 months, there have been attacks from the following countries: Malawi, Benin, Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Other countries with records of attacks beyond this year, going backward, include Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, DR Congo, and the list goes on. There's 28 countries. The source of my information are multiple, including from government. In that regard, I would like to thank the governments of Malawi and Mozambique for their honesty and transparency and for their response to this issue, including opening their doors to allow me to come in to visit officially and to assess the country's situation. Reports of attacks have also been sent to me by family members who have lost members of their families to attacks, and also from NGOs who receive reports from other survivors. While I have not been able to personally verify all cases, there are strong indicators that most of them have occurred. I know a lot of people question the press, but some of my cases have come from the press. That said, I have met with scores of people with albinism and survivors missing body parts, missing legs and arms, many of them with major psychological trauma. These attacks and violations, as earlier mentioned, are driven by misbeliefs about what albinism is, including the myth that our body parts can bring about wealth and good luck when used in witchcraft rituals. Moreover, according to an advocacy report by the Red Cross, the body parts of persons with albinism are worth thousands of dollars on this continent on the black market. An arm is 5,000 USD, a leg same price, and the full body is 75,000 US dollars. This makes you ask, who is involved in these crimes? And if you remember the fact that Mali has elections coming up very soon, and several countries have reported attacks close to elections, we have to be very worried. There are also particular dimensions to these attacks, whereby women and children are particularly affected. For example, data from Malawi shows that 70% of victims are women, 22% are children. And I would like to pause and say thank you to the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child for supporting this issue to date. I would like to take this opportunity to state very clearly that the body parts of persons with albinism do not have supernatural powers, and we certainly do not generate good luck to anyone. People with albinism are human beings like you, and like you, they have the right to life and security of person. Albinism is just a genetic condition. It happens when two parents have the gene, and when those two parents have the gene, there is a 25% chance on each pregnancy that the child will have albinism. Some implications of the condition include low vision, to the point that most people with albinism are considered legally blind, including myself. There are other implications such as health, skin cancer. Only 2% of people with albinism on this continent survive beyond the age of 40. Most people die to skin cancer, a preventable condition, by that age. The frequency of albinism is also more in this continent, and this is why it is our issue. In Europe and in North America, it's 1 in 17,000. Here on the continent, 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 15,000, with many tribes reporting 1 in 1,000. So some of the root causes of the attacks are as follows. 1 is the myths and the misbeliefs. 2 is the issue of poverty and greed, seeking money. 3rd is witchcraft, especially witchcraft-related harmful practices. Here, I use the term broadly to include witchcraft accusations, ritual attacks and killings, muti and juju, and all the variants of supernaturally related harmful practice propagated by alleged traditional practitioners and also witch doctors and spiritual charlatans, including unregulated pastors. Unfortunately, witchcraft-related harmful practices preys on some of the most vulnerable among us, especially persons with albinism, who for many centuries have been mystified, supernaturalized, dehumanized. The Pan-African Parliament could be a force for change. You could begin to put an end to this violence by developing a coherent guide or a coherent policy or a model law to address the issue of harmful practices related to witchcraft. I heard earlier on complaints about defamation law being inherited from a colonial period that no longer applies. Well, that's the same issue with witchcraft. It's even worse. We've inherited laws that mean absolutely nothing and protects none of the vulnerable people. The Regional Action Plan that was referred to earlier on by the Honorable Chair is a 5-year plan that is already in effect since last year, 2017, and will end in 2021. This plan has been endorsed by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. It has 4 main areas, including prevention measures, including awareness raising, protection measures, accountability measures, and finally, equality and non-discrimination measures. One of the concrete measures in the plan is to address this issue of harmful practices related to the phenomena of witchcraft, as well as the issue of trafficking in body parts that are not organs. Most laws cover trafficking in people and in organs, but not body parts. So when people are found with an arm of a person with albinism, what happens is quite despicable. A lot of the times they are charged with lesser offenses, sometimes fines that are worth only $15. In some cases, they have gone back into the community and cut off more body parts. Your support on this issue would be a way of both endorsing and implementing the Regional Action Plan. And by this, you would also be contributing to the achievement of several targets of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and AU Agenda 2063. Therefore, I call upon you, distinguished parliamentarians, to adopt the resolution that Honorable Chair has presented to you. I urge you to condemn these attacks and endorse the Regional Action Plan. I also urge you to raise awareness on this issue and concretely engage in it by providing guidance to states on this issue of witchcraft-related harmful practices, which we have rarely dealt with on this continent. I would like to conclude by stressing that we can make these attacks come to an end. The wait-and-see approach does not work. People have told me, wait and see, it will soon end. A few years ago, witchcraft went after bald men. A few years ago, it went after pregnant women. It will soon end. Well, it has been over a decade and it has not ended. So your help is needed. Together, we can elevate the dignity of every African, irrespective of their color, gender, disability, health condition. I thank you for inviting me here to begin our work together. In particular, I would like to thank the President of the Parliament and the Chair of the Committee of Human Rights and Justice, who you just heard, Madam Ignatienne Nyirarukundo. Also, thanks to your clerk, Mr. Habana, for organizing this. And thank you to each and every one of you distinguished parliamentarians for listening and your willingness to incorporate this issue into your agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. I want to congratulate the President of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights for her intervention. Also to congratulate you for having allowed her this topic to be debated here in this chamber this afternoon. Having heard the words of the second representative, the facts talk about themselves. And she has given us all the details about the suffering of these people for just having a certain color. There is no right that some people to be used with diabolical rituals by personalities who want to be enriched using other human beings, sacrificing their organs while they do not allow the same thing to happen in their own families. So I just want to express my solidarity with you and to urge this assembly to adopt the resolution condemning these malicious facts. And the resolution about this should be sent to all countries, urging them to take measures and to protect these people, because we know that these people who want to revalidate their power and they want to be important in their society using non-adequate means. Now I am speechless now, just want to express to you my gratitude. Thank you.
La parole à l'honorable. Je voulais donner la parole à Is okay? English. English.
Please, can you hear me? Indicate if you can hear the English channel. Please indicate. Okay, I think they can hear us now. Yeah.
English is okay. Madame, you have the floor. Vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je reprends.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is an interference. Is there someone who has a telephone which is open? Thank you, Mr. President. I was saying a while ago that in my country, Burkina Faso, I've noticed something personally, that is, in our own milieu, we scarcely meet albinos in our society, whereas between two countries, I've met many in Côte d'Ivoire. And also towards the west of Burkina Faso, there were albinos, but at the center, you hardly see albinos. In fact, you don't even see them. So I asked the question, why? Do these albinos have something specific about them? Why is it that in this part of the country there are no albinos? And when I asked the question, I was told that when children are born and they notice that they're albinos, they are taken away at night and they are suffocated in the bush. Very honestly, these are old practices, and I was very much moved. And I just wondered, these albinos, they didn't seek to come to this world. They are human beings like us. No one has chosen to be what he or she is. So I noticed that these albinos are victims of discrimination. And they are mocked and ridiculed in the society. And these are things which I've experienced myself, and even mothers who have albinos are not proud of their own children. They feel isolated. Even the husbands do not really feel concerned. And at times when you have albinos, you are sidelined. And at times you even have to go away with your children to live within your family. Mr. President, I believe that this is too much, and it's really, really hard. It's hard to have children. Two people have children, and one person decides to abandon you. This is not really normal. So I believe that this law to protect albinos is welcome, and I believe that it should be supported. It should indeed be enforced, because albinos are human beings like anyone else. They have rights. They need to be protected. The idea of believing that an albino is more talented and should be sacrificed to have the powers of these albinos, we all know that these are strange ideas and they're all wrong. Therefore, I would like to add my voice to those who defend the albinos, so that this law should be enforced, and that very firm and sanctions should be meted on all those who massacre albinos, all those who kill albinos. Thank you. We'll give the floor to the Honorable Deputy from Togo, Amosovir.
Honorable Ernest Joachim from Angola.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to, but I've never been aware that they suffer such problems. And I think that this was an opportune moment to discuss this theme, and that it would also be appropriate that in the recommendations that were drafted, we include a paragraph that it is necessary to also sensitize the population, raise awareness amongst the population, not only on the fact that people with albinism are human beings, but also that make people aware that any body parts or hair of a person suffering from albinism is not worth anything. This is what makes people with albinism be attacked throughout the continent, because some people believe that they have supernatural powers. This is all I had to say, and I thank you for your attention.
Now I want to give the floor to Honorable Dr. Zalikatou Diallo from Guinea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to congratulate the two presenters, the chairperson of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights, and our eminent expert from the United Nations, who gave us a very interesting presentation. I wish to show compassion with my sister from Burkina Faso for this testimony on child killing as a result of albinism. The action plan and the draft resolution are timely. We need to do everything possible to stop this violation of the physical integrity of people living with albinism. The UN expert talked about the profanation of tombs. Even tombs are not saved. So this is really something. The prevalence rate in the world is 1 over 20,000 births. Research shows that cases are more frequent in equatorial Africa and southern America. They are the most affected regions. We need to understand that albinism is a disease like any other disease. It is a genetic disease that is due to the production of melanin. That's why we have this decoloring of the skin. It is a disease like hemophilia, the problems of blood. So we do not. There is no need for exposing these people to witchcraft and these practices. The criminal law punishes all violations of the physical integrity of people living with albinism. So there is the law there. The defense of the rights of persons living with albinism are defended, and there are associations supported by technical and financial partners such as UNFPA. There is a Republican institution in Guinea. The Association of People Living with Albinism is represented by a dignitary, and this association is fighting for the rights of people living with albinism. So these protection measures have to be implemented so as to repress any violations the people living with albinism are suffering from. Thank you. I give the floor now to Honorable Alaji Esdarbu from the Gambia. Honorable El Hadj Diawi Kante from Guinea, you have the floor. I give the floor to Honorable Dr. Kusa Kamba. The general debate is closed. Dear colleagues, Madam Chairperson. I think that we did not have any questions. People expressed their support to what should be done to protect people living with albinism. I think that it is deplorable to come to think today in the 21st century, to think that people living with albinism can give good fortune. These people suffer from misconceptions. We have to help people to get rid of these misconceptions. As long as we do not have this kind of brainwashing, and as indicated by the representative of Burkina Faso, we won't be able to move forward. In Cameroon, we do not see again the corpse of the people, these people. The corpse just disappears. People living with, I have someone living with albinism in my family who died and was buried. But in any case, there are always misconceptions in these countries, and I don't know, I haven't heard any question. I don't know whether, Madam Chair, you wish to reply to these comments. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank the members of the Pan-African Parliament who showed solidarity with this cause. Our colleague said that we needed a resolution. We prepared the resolution, but it has not been translated into the working languages. But it will be ready on time. But the resolution that condemns this is available in French. It is really a shame that in the 21st century we're still discussing these issues. In Africa, we have had different scourges over a long period of time, and now we have this scourge again. Realities are there. There are countries that do not know about this scourge, such as Rwanda, but other countries are seeing their children being killed. There is also the tomb profanation, as indicated earlier on. So, as indicated, we are together in this. We will work together. We need to have legislation that protects these people. Medical assistance needs to be made affordable because there are diseases that are caused by albinism, such as skin conditions. But we need to consider this within the framework of human rights. Thank you very much. Mrs. Ero, do you have something to say?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to address, first of all, say thank you to all the members who have expressed their support. In response to the question from the member from Burkina Faso, why there are in some places reduced